Nous allons passer donc au dernier exposé de la journée. J'ai le privilège d'introduire Jonathan Cohen, qui est professeur à l'université de Princeton et qui est venu donc des États-Unis pour nous parler de ses travaux sur la prise de décision et le rôle des circuits émotionnels dans la prise de décision, cette fois-ci au sein d'un individu. Donc nous passons de la collectivité à un individu unique qui doit prendre sa décision. Et je crois que ce que nous allons voir dans son exposé, c'est qu'au sein d'un individu, au sein de chacun d'entre nous, il y a en fait une petite collectivité qui doit se mettre d'accord pour qu'une décision soit prise. Merci beaucoup, Jonathan. Je dois préciser que Jonathan fera son exposé en anglais. J'espère que ça ne posera pas de difficulté. S'il y a des questions particulières, on pourra bien entendu les traduire du français à l'anglais et vice-versa.
Je vais commencer un peu en français. Je veux commencer à dire que je suis très heureux, aussi honoré d'être ici. J'ai un peu le sentiment de rentrer chez moi, retourner à ma maison, parce que j'habitais à Paris quand j'étais petit, 8 ans et 9 ans, et c'était pendant ce temps que j'ai appris la langue française. Mes études françaises, c'est terminé après ça. J'ai retourné aux États et il y avait presque rien en français. Mais il y a des avantages de ça parce que mes amis français me disent que quand je parle en français, je présente une face beaucoup plus douce et beaucoup plus gentille que celui de mon état naturel en anglais. Enfin, mais je peur que ça ne suffit pas pour donner une présentation scientifique. Alors, c'est pour cette raison que je vais parler anglais après ça. So, with that, I will continue in English, and I beg your forgiveness, but hope that you will be able to follow equally well. It is truly a privilege to be talking in this meeting, which is, of course, about a much broader topic, authority, than I'll be talking about. And so perhaps that's yet another apology I'll offer, which is that I won't be saying anything specific about authority. But I hope that some of the work I'll be presenting will at least give you some ideas and perhaps pique your imagination about how this kind of work that is trying to understand the brain mechanisms underlying essentially human faculties, such as cognition and emotion, may lead ultimately to a deeper understanding of broader questions and more complicated questions, such as the nature of authority. And if there's time at the end, some of the work that I'll talk about may actually get closer to it than where I'll begin. The title of my talk is slightly more elaborate than the one that was offered in French. It's called The Vulcanization of the Human Brain, Cognition, Emotion, Interactions, and Decision-Making. And I will leave till the end an explanation of what I mean by the very first part of the title. This work that I'll be talking about is motivated by a set of fundamental questions that have presented themselves to virtually all manner of study of the human condition. And that is, why do people behave irrationally? And I put irrationally in quotes because it's not entirely clear what rational means. And that alone would be the subject of at least 1 hour and probably more like many weeks' worth of lectures. But I think at some intuitive level, we have an understanding of what it means. And roughly speaking, it refers to inconsistencies in behavior, or in those cases where we can define an optimal form of behavior, it refers to the fact that people don't always behave optimally. And so the question is, why is this? And it's not, as I said, this is not an observation that's unique to any one discipline. And I'll be talking about, as one example of this, economic decision-making. So I've pulled one quote of any number that I could have, but one that I think is particularly germane from Alan Greenspan, the former chair of the Federal, the Federal Reserve in the United States. And what he said is, our economic models, which are built on the notion of rationality, of people acting rationally in their own best interest to maximize utility, our economic models have never been particularly successful in capturing a process driven in large part by non-rational behavior. So here's a discipline that's built on the premise that people behave rationally, and yet one of its chief practitioners is admitting that it has really no bearing on reality. Okay? The question I want to pose is, what can we learn about irrationality or inconsistent or suboptimal behavior by studying the brain? Before I do, though, I want to offer just a few more apologies and also sort of highlight the main points that I'm going to make so that they're not missed. Let me start with the main points, and they're following. That the brain is composed of multiple interacting systems. We have one brain, and it gives rise to one of us and one set of behaviors in any circumstance, but that doesn't mean that it's not composed of many different pieces, different components that may have different dispositions, may have different preferences, may have different modes of responses, and that may not always be acting in total concert with one another. Most of the time they do. I'm able to give a talk like this with a particular purpose and a set of goals, and hopefully achieve those goals in some coherent fashion. But there are many circumstances where the different parts of myself don't present themselves totally in concert. And in situations where different parts have different needs and they can't be met by the same action, they come into competition. And basically, if there's one point you take away from this talk, it's that that competition between systems accounts for the sorts of irrationalities that we see in behavior. Okay. The second main point, and this is more of a methodological point, is that we can conjecture about multiple systems within the mind by observing behavior and assuming that the only way we can explain the inconsistencies of behavior is the operation of different entities. But it's very hard to prove that. However, if we can crack open the box and look inside and see the engagement of different subsystems under different circumstances when the person is behaving in different ways, then we can gain more direct evidence for the fact that there are in fact multiple interacting agents, and maybe ultimately refine our understanding of them as individual agents, because we'll be able to see when they're functioning and when they're not, and thereby make attributions to them that we can only infer when we're looking at behavior. And so here is the argument for neuroimaging, at least as one tool of neuroscience, as being useful and informative in understanding the underlying basis of decision-making, even at the psychological level. Okay. And then finally, as I go along, and if there's time at the end, I'll add some evolutionary speculations. And I emphasize here the word speculation. It's very hard to sort of make any strong case for why it is that the brain evolved the way it did, especially the human brain, because we don't have much of a record of what the conditions were as it was evolving. But I think evolutionary speculations, if they don't at least serve as sort of a satisfying of intellectual curiosity, they also can provide ideas that could lead to new hypotheses that can be empirically tested here and now. And so what I'm going to offer is some thoughts that we've had, when I say we, myself and my colleagues, about why it is that there are multiple agents in the brain and why it is that they come into contact with one another the way they do. And from that, hopefully engender hypotheses that can then lead to predictions that can be tested in the laboratory. Okay, a couple of caveats or apologies before I jump in. The first is that although I believe firmly that the language of science is mathematics, it's not English or French or any other natural language, and that true understanding is only really achieved when one can be precise in the form of an explicit mathematical formulation or, at the very least, a computer simulation, I'm not going to be talking about any work like that in this talk, and there are many reasons for that, some of which have to do with time, but others of which have to do with the fact that this is a domain in which we're just starting to understand the component processes, and we're just starting to parse the major divisions within the system. And so, frankly, I don't have much to say by way of formal theory. That's not to say that that's not critically important and that, in fact, we're not working on it. And again, if at the end there's time, I'll mention briefly some work that we've begun to do using game theoretic approaches to try and flesh out and formalize some of the ideas that I'll describe. But the main purpose of this talk is really to provide you with the evidentiary basis for the sorts of ideas that I'm presenting, rather than any formally explicit theory of it. Finally, I want to emphasize that I'm going to use words in rather simple-minded ways for the sake of discourse. I'm going to use words like cognitive and emotional as if they refer to single entities or single systems within the brain. But in fact, we know that's not the case. Cognition is made up of a large, complex array of systems and networks that really I don't think can be accurately captured by a single word cognitive, and similarly for emotional. Nevertheless, the distinction between cognitive and emotional I think is useful enough in this context and makes it easier to describe what I'm talking about that I hope you'll forgive me the oversimplification in using these terms as I do. And the same will be true for parts of the brain. I'm going to be referring, for example, to the prefrontal cortex. part of the brain that's in the front of the brain and that is thought to be responsible for most of those faculties that characterize us as humans, and a part of the brain, in fact, that developed most recently in the human brain. But it alone is not responsible for the sorts of faculties I'll be talking about. It works together with other areas of the brain, the parietal cortex, the basal ganglia, neuromodulatory systems. I refer to it alone, again, for simplicity, and because it sits, I think, at the heart of a nexus of systems and is critical, if not responsible alone, for the sorts of faculties that I'll be talking about. So, with your forgiveness for these simplifications, let me move forward. Here's a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to take two examples of domains in which irrational or inconsistent behavior have been observed and have been highlighted and have been studied. One is from the domain of moral philosophy, and the other from economic decision-making. And I picked these to sort of illustrate the breadth of domains in which I think the fundamental principles that I'll be talking about apply, to show you that they really, I think, are general principles and not specific to individual domains of decision-making or behavior. And then, as I've already said, I'll offer some behavioral and neuroimaging evidence in support of the fact that there are multiple systems that come into play in decision-making in these circumstances, and then some speculations as to why the interplay between these systems may have arisen as it does, that is, through the course of evolution. Okay, one last prefatory comment, and I won't belabor this now, because there's not much time, but I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that I'm at a stage in my career where I get to be the front person and tell you about the work, but not actually be the person that does it. These are the people who have actually done the work, and in particular, the work I'll be talking about today is that of Josh Green, who I'll say more about in just a moment, Sam McClure, Jim Rilling, and Alan Samfey, all of whom have gone on now to very successful faculty positions. Josh at Harvard, Sam at Stanford, Jim at Emory, and Alan at the University of Arizona. So this is all work that they did as postdocs when they were in my lab. So let me start with an example from the domain of moral reasoning. And this is work that was done largely by Josh Green. In fact, it was conceived by him. I moved to Princeton about 9 years ago to be the director of a neuroscience program and build a neuroimaging facility. We're proud that it was the first to be built outside of a medical facility specifically dedicated for basic science research on the human brain. But the first person to cross my door when I got to Princeton was this wild-eyed, bushy-haired young philosophy student. And he came in my office and he said he had a great idea for an imaging study. And my first thought was, oh my God, is this what it means to be at Princeton where there's no medical school? The philosophers are the ones that are going to want to be doing the work. And I had great worries about this. And as I tried to compose my polite rejection of him and get him out my door so I could get back to doing the work I was supposed to be doing, it took about 5 minutes for me to work that through in my head. And in that time, he convinced me not only that he was brilliant, but that he had a wonderfully interesting and I think potentially important line of research. And that's what I'll tell you about here. His interest was in a set of moral dilemmas, and it's easiest to describe them by example. So I'll give you those examples, and then we'll sort of step back and look at them and ask what they tell us. They're known as, collectively, as the trolley dilemma. And there are two scenarios that make up the trolley dilemma. The first one is called the switch scenario, and it goes as follows. There's a trolley or a train that's coming down a track, and there's a switch on the track, and it's set so that if nothing is done, the train is going to go along this switch point, and it's going to kill all 5 workmen that happen to be working on the track at that point. Okay? But there's a switch here that controls the branch point, and Joe here is standing by the switch. And if Joe flips this switch, he can divert the trolley off onto the side track where there's 1 workman. Right? Now, it'll kill that workman, but it'll spare these 5. And the question is it morally acceptable for Joe to flip that switch? Now, let me just mention a few things here as part of the game rules, okay, ground rules. First of all, everything I've told you applies with 100% certainty, and there's no hidden tricks. So, for example, there's no chance that these guys could yell and warn Joe about, or warn this guy about the fact that Joe's about to flip the switch, or that Joe could yell and warn them. The situation is as I described it. You have to accept that, or else we're going to spend the next hour arguing about things that I think are actually diversionary. Okay? So, given the situation as I described it, the question is it morally acceptable for Joe to flip the switch? And the other point that I want to drive home is that I'm not asking you whether you would flip the switch. This is, in some sense, not a directly psychological question. Right? It's not whether you'd be able to do it. It's whether you think it's morally acceptable. If you were on a jury, would you say that it was morally acceptable for Joe to have flipped that switch? So let's have a show of hands. How many people think it's morally acceptable for Joe to flip the switch? Okay. So many hands go up. Not as many as I might say as in the United States, which is interesting. We're actually funded to do some cross-cultural studies with this, and maybe I've just begun. Okay, so I'll take it that a majority agreed that it was morally acceptable. Okay, here's a variant of the scenario. The trolley's coming down the track, only this time there's no branch, and although there are still 5 workmen on the track, so if nothing is done, the trolley is going to kill all 5 workmen, as in the previous scenario. But now there's a footbridge, and Joe is standing on it, and he notices that there's another large workman that's sort of hanging precariously off the edge of the bridge, maybe repointing the bricks on the bridge. And Joe realizes that if he moves quickly, he can run over and push this workman off. This workman will land straight on the track. And again, you have to assume that there's a 100% chance that he's going to land straight on the track. And furthermore, he's big enough so as to stop the trolley. So if the trolley comes down and hits him, it'll kill him, but it will be stopped, and these 5 will be spared. Okay? So again, you just have to accept the scenario as stated. And now the question is, again, is whether or not it's morally acceptable to push for Joe to push this workman off the bridge. So a show of hands, how many people think it's morally acceptable? Few hands go up, but nowhere near as many. Okay? Also, it's worth noting, I don't know if I'll have time to come back to this later, but it is interesting to note that they tend to go up more slowly for this one. Okay, so what's going on? I mean, I heard a little bit of chuckling, and I gather that that reflects an awareness that there's sort of an inconsistency here. I mean, both have the same superficial structure, 5 for 1, right? In both cases, you're being asked whether or not it's acceptable for Joe to sacrifice 1 life to spare another 5. And yet, in one case, most people think it's okay, and in the other, they don't. And just to show you that this is not an unusual circumstance, or an unusual sample, we've done this study now many, many times, both in the laboratory. We've actually had people go out, ironically, to places where we could collect many, many samples of responses. Ironically, the easiest place to do that is at a train station during rush hour. And so we've had undergraduates go and ask people for $3 to answer one of these questions or the other, or many others like them. And over all of these studies, both in our laboratory and in many other laboratories, what one finds is that most of the time, in our case, 90% of the time, subjects say it's okay to flip the switch in the first scenario, much as most of you did. But in the footbridge scenario, only 30% of the people say okay. That is, it reverses itself. So these are empirical data sort of reaffirming what we witnessed anecdotally in here. So the question is why? Well, philosophers are not idle, and they think about this carefully. And in fact, there's a rather trivial account of this particular scenario that the philosophers can offer that goes back to Immanuel Kant that renders both responses consistent. So what we're looking for, much as the economists are looking for rational principles of decision-making with regard to money, philosophers are looking for rational, consistent principles of decision-making with regard to moral value. And here's one that Kant offered us that actually can make these responses consistent. Kant said that one should never act in treating another person with them as an end, with them as a means. One should never act to use somebody as a means, only as an end. Another way of saying that is you should never use people for a purpose. They can be the consequence, but they can never be the means. Well, if we go back and look at these 2 scenarios, they differ according to exactly that principle. So in this case, Joe, if he flips the switch, is going to cause the death of this guy here, but he's not using this guy. This guy is not a means. In fact, if you remove this guy, everything's fine. It's a no-brainer, if you will, right? Nobody's going to die. Of course Joe should flip the switch. So this person has no sort of utility in the situation, right? And so according to Kant, that's okay. It's unfortunate that this person dies, but you're not using him. So according to Kant, that's okay. In this situation, however, it's very different. Here, Joe is really using this guy. If this guy were not here, there's nothing Joe could do. You could say, well, maybe Joe could jump down himself, but let's say Joe is too skinny, and so if he jumps, the trolley will run right over him, kill him, and go ahead and kill the 5, so there's no purpose in that, right? So in order to affect good, the greater good here, Joe has to use this guy. And even though that will save 5, according to Kant, that's not acceptable, right? Because you're using this person as a means, it's not just a matter of the ends. So one could then surmise that all of you are Kantian, and that down deep, whether conscious of it or not, I'm not saying you mentally computed this sort of principle, but maybe somehow down deep, whether genetically or maybe through culture, you've been imbued with, you've learned this principle, and you're able to reflexively apply it. Well, that would be a nice story for the philosophers if it were true, but it's not true. How do we know it's not true? Because we can do the experiment. We can take the scenario, the switch scenario, and modify it as follows. We can just add a little bit of track right here. Okay? And so now, if Joe flips the switch and the trolley comes along here, and this workman is not there, the trolley's going to continue around and kill all 5. So in that sense, if Joe flips the switch and diverts the train from killing these 5, he's using this guy, in effect, to stop the train, much as he would be using him if he pushed him off the footbridge. So in this case, he's using this person as a means, and according to Kant, or to you if you were Kantian, you should say no to this scenario. You should now say that what was acceptable before, because of this little bit of track, now is no longer acceptable. But I think you can intuit that that's not what you would say, and in fact, that's not what subjects say. There's a little bit of movement. Maybe we go from 90% to 70% of people saying it's okay to flip the switch, but there's still a vast difference between this level of response and this in the footbridge scenario. That's unaccounted for by Kant. So Kant isn't right. So what's the explanation? Well, we could spend the next hour, and again, probably many more than that, discussing this, and philosophers and psychologists have. Suffice it to say that many behavioral studies have been done, and we've used many different scenarios in our laboratory, so of other laboratories, and none of them provide any sort of coherent, rational account of the sort that I just offered you, even if it varies in the details, of say, the Kantian type. But Josh's hypothesis, what drove him to this research, was a different sort of hypothesis. It wasn't that there's some hidden underlying principle that might explain it, but rather that these scenarios, the different scenarios, evoke different responses within us. Some evoke a sort of a calculating, utilitarian, actuarial analysis of how many deaths are worthy of how many others, but others just evoke a gut emotional response, a no, that's not acceptable, don't do it response. So his hypothesis is that when people are confronted with the footbridge scenario, they have an emotional response, not a cognitive response. I point to my heart, but obviously I mean a different part of the brain. Okay? So here's his emotion hypothesis. The thought of pushing a person is more emotionally salient than that of flipping a switch. And that such emotional responses can, in fact, moral judgments, much as that actuarial computation of statistics can. Another way of saying that is that you get a bad feeling about pushing the person off the bridge, and you translate that into a value judgment. You say, therefore, it's no good. Now, we can debate the sort of prescriptive value of this. I suspect that it's actually a very important equation, and it's certainly one that's playing itself out in American politics. As many of you know, there's big debates about things like gay marriage. And during the last election, some have argued that Karl Rove, advisor to George Bush, specifically looked at the states in which there was a balance, where it could have gone either way, to Kerry or to Bush, and put on the ballot the gay marriage issue because of the emotional value that it had, the emotions that it would react to. Right? And I have to confess to you, I'm sort of sympathetic to that. It so happens, I'm not going to reveal too much about my politics, but I will about my sexuality. I am heterosexual, but I have several close friends, including one close college roommate who was homosexual. And as close as we were, and as much as I loved him as a friend, every once in a while, the thought of what he did late at night crossed my mind, and I got the heebie-jeebies. And I wanted to say, don't do it, it's bad. Now, personally, I don't think it's bad. I think it's bad. It makes me feel bad, but I don't think it's wrong. So for me, this is a false equation. But for others, it's actually it's a valid equation. For example, Leon Kass, the chair of George Bush's Council on Bioethics, that is the body that advises the President of the United States on ethical principles in science, has specifically said that this is right. He's written a treatise called the Morality of Repugnance. And the claim is that if something makes you feel bad, it must be wrong. Okay? So this is a debatable point, whether this is a good or a bad equation. Our purpose, though, as scientists, is not to say whether it's good or bad, but simply to establish whether it exists empirically by studying it in the laboratory. So that was Josh's idea, to show that people actually respond this way. When they feel bad about something, they tend to say it's wrong. So how could we do that? Well, you could ask people whether or not they had feelings about, pushing a person off a bridge, and many people might tell you. Some may feel them but not tell you, and I suspect on this side of the Atlantic that's less likely than on the other side of the Atlantic, especially among men. American men don't like to admit that they have emotions even when they do have them. And then, of course, there's the possibility that there are emotions that about which we're not conscious. Freud taught us that many, many decades ago. So just asking people isn't going to do it. Now, there are other ways of going at it. One could do various sort of peripheral measures of physiology, but all of those have their problems. And we were fortunate enough to have access to a scanner that could tell us whether or not parts of the brain were active, which parts of the brain were active while people were performing these tasks. And the supposition was that different parts of the brain represent emotions, then represent the processes or are involved in the processes that do the calculation of 5 versus 1. Now, that was a conjecture. It wasn't a totally arbitrary conjecture. I won't take the time to describe the case of Phineas Gage in any detail, but I suspect some of you are familiar with him. Ironically, again, he was a railroad worker. I don't know why trains factor so heavily in this line of work, but they seem to. He was a railroad worker around the turn of the last century, late 1800s, and he had the misfortune of having an accident when he was tamping down a charge for building some new part of the railroad track to prematurely set the charge off, and it drove this rod, this tamping iron, up through the front of his head, through the middle of his frontal cortex, and out the top. And the miracle was that 3 weeks later, he was up and around and walking. So from a medical perspective, it was a miracle. But what people quickly noticed, and became sort of a famous case in literature, is that his personality changed. He became lascivious, sort of hypersexual. He became irresponsible. He started spending all of his money, gambling it. His wife ended up divorcing him. And he ended up sort of destitute as a sort of reject from society. And he had started, I should add, as a very responsible foreman on a train crew. So clearly there was something about this part of the brain that was lesioned that changed his personality. And one might argue, in looking at the things that changed, it was that his moral sensibilities, among other things, had changed. So the notion that there are parts of the brain that correspond to emotional/moral sensibilities, or at least are important in those, was not entirely without prior precedent. Of course, we don't want to stick these sorts of rods through our undergraduate subjects in our experiments, and so we resorted to a more tame procedure, or at least what we thought was more tame. Some of our subjects don't agree with us always. They're in the scanner sometimes for 2 hours, lying there still, so it's another form of torture. But the supposition was that we would be able to observe the patterns of brain activity while people were performing these sorts of moral judgments and see whether or not, in one case, emotional areas were activated, and in another, more cognitive areas were activated. The experiment, of course, has to be done many times, even within an individual, because a single image is very, very noisy and doesn't give us a reliable signal. So we had to construct a corpus of moral dilemmas, and we divided them into 3 types. 20 that were personal, me hurt you, me push you off bridge, okay, that we presumed or hypothesized would elicit an emotional response. 20 that were impersonal, more of the switch variety, where the harm that was caused to the person that was going to suffer for the sake of the greater good was removed from the individual who actually had to produce the harm. And then, as a control, 20 non-moral sort of cognitive puzzles. And these were included in order to control for non-specific factors like mental effort and sort of the time of how long it took to respond. It turned out that this was a very interesting and, I think, informative condition, as you'll see in just a moment. So we gave subjects these 60 dilemmas in randomized order, of course, and looked at what happened in the brain as they performed these. And I'm not going to describe the study in any more detail than that. If you have questions about the technical aspects, please feel free to ask me either at the end or offline. Here's what we found. First of all, we identified all the areas that were active during the performance of the task. And I'm not showing them all here because they wouldn't fit on this slide, but I'm showing characteristic ones, including dorsolateral prefrontal cortex right here, medial frontal cortex right here, and then other areas such as the posterior cingulate cortex and the angular gyrus in the parietal lobes. And these can roughly be characterized based on many, many previous studies as typically being engaged either by more emotional stimuli or non-emotional stimuli. So, for example, the prefrontal cortex, an area that I study extensively in other work and that Stan DeHaan has done a lot of work studying, is very commonly, almost universally activated when people do sort of mental arithmetic problems or do sort of abstract problem solving. Okay? Things that typically you don't think about as having strong emotional content, except maybe perhaps the person's motivation to get the answer right. As compared to these other areas, in particular, medial frontal cortex and and posterior cingulate that are very commonly activated in either social or emotional circumstances. When people are presented with pictures of stimuli that are either very appealing or are emotionally aversive, or are asked to interpret interactions between other individuals in, say, videos, and infer what the emotional responses of those subjects or those people in the video were. So I've color-coded these as red if they're typically engaged by emotions. And note, none of these previous studies have involved moral decision-making. So these are all findings that have involved emotions or cognition independent of moral decision-making. So the ones that are typically engaged by emotions are colored in red, and the ones that are engaged by cognitive functions, more abstract processes, analytic processes, are colored in blue. Here, just the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And what I want to call your attention to is the pattern of activity of these areas under the three conditions of our experiment. So when subjects were deliberating about moral, personal dilemmas, such as pushing the person off the footbridge, the areas that are typically associated with emotional processing were substantially more activated and statistically significantly more activated than the cognitive areas, the blue areas. In contrast, when they were contemplating moral impersonal dilemmas, the blue areas, the cognitive areas, were more active than the emotional areas. And this pattern looked strikingly similar to the one that was observed when they were contemplating non-moral, abstract, mathematical, or logistical problems. So this provides at least a first round of evidence that, in fact, when people respond to these two different types of dilemmas, they respond very differently. Or put differently, different parts of them respond and prevail. Now, that's nice, but it's correlational. Right? How do we know, for example, that this emotional activity preceded as opposed to followed the response? Maybe what happened is after subjects said, you know, Joe shouldn't push the person off the bridge, they got a wave of guilt and thought, oh my God, I'm such a horrible person. I would have let 5 people die just because I thought it was bad to push one off the bridge. And that's the emotional response we're seeing here. How do we know that? Well, we don't. So we have to do other studies. And we've done a number. I'm not going to tell you about them all because I want to move on. But let me just mention one that I think helps make the point. And this is a study in which we tried to look at the time course of activity and establish that the patterns of activity that we're seeing here actually preceded the decision-making process and were correlated with it on a case-by-case basis rather than sort of group averaging and just correlating overall without knowing exactly when things happened. And in that study, because there were so few, what we wanted were cases in particular where somebody was contemplating something that was emotional and then either succeeded in or by our hypothesis, succeeded in overcoming that emotional response and making a utilitarian response, for example, saying, yes, it's okay to push the person off the footbridge, okay, or did not succumb to the emotional response and didn't do that. So in the dilemmas that we gave, most of the ones that were like the footbridge that evoked an emotional response, usually people acquiesced to the emotional response. They didn't overcome it. So we needed ones where people were more imbalanced. So we had to construct new dilemmas. For example, here's one. We call it the crying baby dilemma. You're in a town at war. The enemy soldiers are descending upon your town. You have it on good authority that every other town that they've been through near yours, they've been on a genocidal rage. They've killed everybody, women, children, men, everything. And they're about to enter your town. And so the town gathers and decides to go hide in the basement somewhere where they can sort of camouflage the entrance. And you're down there. You have to have your baby with you, of course. The enemy soldiers enter, and your baby starts to cry. And now the question is it acceptable for you to smother your baby in order to save everybody in the town? If you don't, everybody's going to die, including the baby. Well, it turns out that about 50% of people say it's okay, that you should do it. But about 50% of the people still say, no, it's not morally acceptable. And again, we can debate whether that's right or wrong, but the data are that people fall 50-50. So now the question is, in those situations where there's a strong emotional response, how does the brain activity play out? Well, in those dilemmas, when we give people dilemmas like that, we always get these emotional areas. So I'm not going to show you that, okay? But what I will show you is what happens in the prefrontal cortex as a function of whether people end up saying that it's okay to smother the baby or not okay to smother the baby. And here are those data. So that here's where the dilemma is presented. Here's you can't see it, I apologize, it's sort of faint, but there's a line right here that's the time at which the response is made. So this is time along this axis. And this is the activity of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in those cases in which the subjects went on at this point here to say it's okay to smother the baby or not. And what you can see is in those cases where they went on to say it's okay to smother the baby, there was much more frontal activity than in those cases in which they didn't, suggesting that the activity of the prefrontal cortex in this case, antecedent to, preceding the decision, predicts what the ultimate decision is. So this makes a stronger case for causality than the data that I showed you before. There are many other studies like this now that I think lead us to be able to say with confidence that these systems really are playing a causal role in the decision-making process. So let me just quickly summarize these findings and offer a sort of conjecture and an interpretation or two, and then move on to another domain. What have we learned? Well, first of all, that emotional responses do seem to come into play in moral decisions. Not all moral decisions elicit emotional responses. Some don't, such as the switch case. But those that do seem to occur through sort of proximal interactions, of sort of very close, personal, hands-on, sort of me-hurt-you situation. They don't occur to more distal interactions. So why might this be? Why would we have emotions that respond in one case and not another? Well, here I'm going to venture some speculations, some evolutionary speculations. Okay? And I refer to this sort of loosely as the local optimization hypothesis. The idea that evolution actually does produce optimal solutions to problems it faces, but it faces very specific problems, and it doesn't come up with general solutions. So let's just imagine what we were like, you know, 1 million years ago, okay? Or let's say even before that. We're out there on the savannah. We're solitary creatures. We haven't developed into a social species yet. And I come upon a piece of food, right? And all of a sudden, I see another human or another animal of any sort come upon that food and start to make a move to eat it. So what should I do? What's the best thing for me to do? Kill that other agent right then and there, whether it's another human or not, right? Because not only will I secure that food for myself, I'll ensure that any other food in nearby vicinity is likely to be mine, and maybe I can even eat that person, right? So there's nothing prohibiting me from killing that person. And presumably, we were evolved to be aggressive in that way, at the very least. On the other hand, that's not particularly useful if you're going to develop as a social species, right? If, in fact, it helps for us to team up so we can catch even more food, then somehow, if I've already got that aggressive and competitive instinct, I've got to overcome it. So what I'd like to propose is that our emotional response against hurting members of our clan, if not other members of our species, is one that was sort of a necessary adaptation to be able to develop sociality. We had to suppress our competitive urges in order to be able to cooperate. I'm, of course, not the first to suggest that. This is sort of a well-trodden theoretical ground in evolutionary psychology. But what we want to ask now is, what are the conditions under which that might have evolved? That emotional response might have occurred against hurting somebody else. Well, in those days, you know, all you could do to hurt somebody else would be, of course, to hit them if they were close enough, or to bop them on the head with a stick, or maybe to throw a stone at them. But anything literally out of a stone's throw is not possible. And evolution is, in fact, an opportunistic process. Problems that it doesn't confront, it doesn't adapt to. And so these emotional responses that we developed against hurting our conspecifics may have become very specific to the sorts of things we could do, and not things that we couldn't do, like flip switches that would cause a train to divert and kill somebody on a track, you know, a mile away. No less hit a button and kill millions of people thousands of miles away, right? And I think that's a profound observation because, and it's, again, it's not a new one. I mean, in the 60s, people talked about putting the button for the nuclear arsenal in the president's closest associate's chest. So that if ever he had to use that button, he'd have to rip open the chest of this person that he cared about in order to get to it. Why? Because he's probably going to have greater emotional response about ripping open this person's chest than the prospect of millions of deaths thousands of miles away. I mean, a crazy equation, but one that at least this provides an evolutionary account of. And I think that people were sort of intuiting when they proposed such scenarios. Okay, so that's a hypothesis. And let's just leave that on the table for a moment and come back to it. Okay, let me switch to another domain. How much time do I have? 5 minutes? Ooh. Okay. Let me go through this quickly, because I do want to get to some of the final comments. So we see similar sorts of competition in other domains, and in particular, economic decision-making. Here's a classic one, the choice between something now and later. So if I offer you 1,000 euros now or 1,010 euros in a week, which would you prefer? Right? Most people, most undergraduates in the laboratory, I'll tell you, prefer 1,000 euros right now. On the other hand, if I offer them, this should be, sorry, that was supposed to be 1,001. I got my numbers wrong. If I offer them 1,000 euros a year from now, or 1,001 euros a year and a week from now, so it's the same 1 week difference, but it's all going to happen a year from now, all of a sudden most people say, well, what the hell, it's a week, a year from now, I don't care, I might as well get the extra dollar. From the economics perspective, that's totally insane, right? If you're going to discount the weight, a euro, a weight of 1 week by 1 euro, then you should do it for today, for this week, as well as any other week in the future, barring any known cataclysms of the markets that are likely to occur. And if you don't buy this, then we can see this sort of thing in many, many other circumstances. I'll give you my favorite, which is, well, actually not my favorite, but perhaps the most compelling, drug addiction. I offer an alcoholic his liver the rest of his life, a drink in a week or his liver the rest of his life. And he says, well, I'll take my liver, thank you. What about a drink tomorrow or your liver the rest of your life? And he says, well, I'll take my liver, thank you. I say, well, what about this drink right here, right now, and you don't even get to mention his liver? Right, down goes the drink. So again, reversals of preference based on the fact that when something is immediate, it gains tremendously more value to us than it seems to have if it's even a little bit in the future. Okay? So economists have sort of formalized the discounting functions, and they've shown that the optimal discounting function is exponential. This is not what people do. So if something is more valuable, something that's available later is sufficiently more valuable so as to warrant taking it over something that's available earlier, then it always maintains its greater value. So here we are now. This is, exponentially discounted value back to the present. These things are available in the future. And as we move forward, the later one, but more valuable one, always remains more valuable. But that's not what people do. People behave more according to hyperbolic discounting, which is described something like this. Right? Here again are the same two things worth the same amounts with the same disparity, only with hyperbolic discounting. Even though right now this is more valuable to you, as you get closer to the earlier one, all of a sudden, boom, it becomes more valuable, and you choose it. So this is a description of what people do, but it's not an explanation of why people do it. In fact, it violates the basic dicta of economic theory, which is that people behave rationally. This is irrational. This is not optimal. Okay? So why do people do it? Well, some economists have suggested that maybe this reflects the compounding of two interest rates, or two discount functions. One that has very slow discounting and one that has steep discounting. And that sort of rung a bell in my and my colleagues' ears, thinking, well, yeah, there's certain parts of the brain that are likely to be much more selfish and impetuous than others. In particular, the brainstem, the parts of the brain rich in dopamine may be reflecting, that are evolutionarily very old, may be reflecting very steep discount rates. Right? Whereas the prefrontal cortex, which knows about the future, may actually reflect a much shallower discount rate. And so the combination of those two might produce this sort of hyperbolic discount function in a way that a single function wouldn't. Okay? So this is sort of the economic theory, and we've translated that into a neuroscientific theory, that the limbic system, the dopamine system, has very steep discounting, and the prefrontal cortex has shallower discounting. It's the rational discounter. It knows about the future. Well, how can we test this? Again, we can put people in the scanner, and without describing to you the study or the results in any detail, because I'm afraid I'm not going to have time to get on to the other points I want to make, let me just say that the findings beautifully corroborate the theory, that when people make decisions for later items, prefrontal cortex is more active than when they make decisions based on sort of the immediate availability of something. And many of the same areas are engaged here as were engaged in that moral reasoning study. So this provides sort of convergent evidence from another domain that when people make decisions, whether they're economic or moral, they're engaging different parts of the system. And it's a competition between these different parts of the system that actually lead to the behavior. And here, too, I think we can invoke this local optimization hypothesis. Limbic responses reflect the operation of mechanisms that have been around literally since the beginning of quadrupeds, right? Since the beginning of mammals and even perhaps back into the reptilian brain. And one might guess that way, way back then, having steep discount rates made a lot of sense. It was use it or lose it. There were no bank accounts. There were no refrigerators. There were no property laws. So if you didn't consume what you had, you weren't going to have it. So you might as well discount the future steeply because there wasn't much value in the future for most goods. But along comes the prefrontal cortex, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment, and now suddenly there is a future. There are bank accounts, there are refrigerators, there are property rights. And so now there is a purpose in valuing future rewards. And so these two systems have different discount rates and in certain circumstances compete with each other. Okay, let me just conclude by stepping back and drawing some perhaps even more controversial and speculative interpretations, but ones that I think have potentially profound sociological or societal consequences. And this begins to explain the title of my talk. I titled it The Vulcanization of the Human Brain, with this, in part, the meaning of, that I had in mind of vulcanization. We vulcanize rubber to give it new properties, elasticity, flexibility, greater strength. And we can think about the development of the prefrontal cortex in some sense as having vulcanized the human brain, as having given it flexibility and elasticity. In fact, as I said earlier, this part of the brain is thought to be responsible for most of those higher cognitive faculties that distinguish us as humans, things like reasoning and problem solving and language. Okay? Interestingly, it's exactly those faculties that have produced the technologies that create the circumstances in which we seem to exhibit irrational behavior. So it's given us the opportunity to create violence at a distance, right? Pressing a button and killing millions of people thousands of miles away, for which we don't have a strongly adapted emotional response. It's created refrigerators and bank accounts that make it silly to be impetuous and spend our money as soon as we have it and eat all the food on our plates when we're full and we may have problems with obesity, or to consume drugs that we know we're going to get addicted to. So in this sense, the development of the prefrontal cortex, or the vulcanization of the human brain, as I like to put it, has put us in peril. It's created drugs of abuse, games of addiction, and of course, the capability for mass destruction if we're not careful in our use of these technologies. At the same time, our studies have shown that the prefrontal cortex is precisely the part of the brain that permits rational decision-making in the face of competing, I would argue, evolutionarily older emotional responses. Right? It's the part of the brain that favored the utilitarian response in that moral reasoning study, and that favors saving in those situations where something in the future is worth more than what you're being offered right now. So in that sense, the vulcanization of the brain can save us. And that's the other sense in which I use the word vulcanization. For those of you who are familiar with Star Trek, Mr. Spock was a Vulcan, and Vulcans were specifically characterized as being purely logical in their processing. But even Gene Roddenberry, who created this character, knew that this was sort of a silly answer. Right? That pure logic is not the right answer. At the end of every episode, it was actually the human commander of the spaceship that prevailed and said, Mr. Spock, your analysis of the problem was very helpful, but in the end, it was my human intuition and my human capacity for care that really got us to the, to the solution to the problem. So I don't think this is really the answer. It's something more like this. Freud was, of course, fascinated by the relationship between cognition and emotion and what's the right balance. In our Western tradition, maybe he's perhaps iconic of that attempt to understand the interplay between these. But there are other traditions, such as Tibetan Buddhism, that have tried to understand what are the circumstances in which emotions are helpful and what are the circumstances in which we have to sort of step back from our emotions and use our ability for analysis. And it's not an easy answer. There are no easy answers. But it seems like some sort of rapprochement between these is what we need to understand better. So I think that's a point worth making. But the last point that I think is really important is to realize that there's a sociological dimension to this. It takes relatively few vulcanized brains to generate technological developments like weapons of mass destruction, okay? But it takes all of them, or many of them, to ensure that they're put to appropriate use. So there's sort of a race between the development of our brains and the capacity they give us, and our actually exercising of that capacity to balance reason with emotion. And this is what I think worries me the most, is that we're in a world where we have all the capacity of these technologies, but we haven't sort of permeated that ability through all of our social strata and all of our cultures to be able to respond to them always with the right balance between rationality and emotion. And for this, I think we can start to develop formal models. I don't have time to describe some of the work we've done, but perhaps if there are questions about it, I could do so at the end. So let me just, this is just describing some population sort of game theory models that we've done to try and look at this at a sociological level. So let me just end with sort of a more impassioned statement, which is given by this cartoon here from the New Yorker in the fateful year of 1937. For those of you who can't see it in the back, it's a bunch of government officials, old men sitting in an austere governmental building, and the caption is, "Oh, let's declare war and get the whole damn thing over with." Sounds familiar, right? My hope is that with a little bit more understanding of this relationship between the different parts of the brain that constitute cognitive versus emotional processes, and a scientific basis for the sorts of thing that Freud was seeking, and that the Dalai Lama, as the head of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, is seeking actively now, we can end up with something closer to this than the last cartoon. Thank you for your attention.